In the 19th century, if you wanted to start a war, fund a railroad, or save an empire from collapse, you didn't go to a king, you went to a family. For nearly 100 years before the Nazis ever took power, the Rothschilds sat at the top of an unspoken hierarchy in Europe. Kings and emperors answered to them. Aristocrats married into the family to secure access to their fortune. Industrial tycoons competed for nothing more than the privilege of a business relationship with them. This was not simply a wealthy family. This was the largest private fortune the modern world had ever recorded. And in the 1930s, a movement would rise that built its entire identity around destroying them. What happened between those two facts, absolute financial supremacy and a regime determined to erase the family from history, is one of the strangest survival stories of the 20th century. This is how the most powerful banking dynasty in the world nearly fell to the Third Reich, and how it didn't. To understand why the Nazis saw the Rothschilds as a singular threat, you first have to understand exactly how unprecedented their power was. Before the Rothschilds, banking was a local affair. If your money was in London, it stayed in London. There was no real mechanism to move capital across national borders quickly or reliably. The Rothschild family broke that model entirely. They built a coordinated network of brothers and branches across London, Frankfurt, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, effectively inventing what we'd now call cross-border finance. It functioned as a 19th century version of an international wire transfer system, allowing the family to move capital between countries faster than most governments could track it. As state oversight of cross-border money grew weaker relative to their network, the family itself became indispensable to governments seeking credit. The 19th century was, in large part, one continuous cycle of European wars. For most institutions, that was instability. For the Rothschilds, it was simply a business cycle. Their strategy was consistent. They did not pick sides. They financed multiple combatants in the same conflict simultaneously, a hedge that guaranteed their position regardless of outcome. A German prince, Hermann von Pückler-Muskau, is widely quoted as observing that no power in Europe could seriously consider waging war without first reckoning with the Rothschilds. If a state wanted to fight, it likely needed Rothschild credit to do it. Thrones change hands, territories change flags, and through nearly all of it, both winners and losers carried debt to the same family. War financing was only one layer of the empire. Rothschild capital also flowed directly into the Industrial Revolution, funding railways, mines, and manufacturing across the continent. Through that investment, the family became major shareholders in some of the most powerful companies of the era. They went further still, acquiring positions in the raw resources those industries depended on: oil, coal, iron, and copper, across Europe, Latin America, and Africa. By the close of the 19th century, the banking group held major influence over global trade in oil and metals. This gave them leverage that went beyond markets. With a single decision, they could starve a rival economy of raw materials, or fund the very factories that would outcompete it. After France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the country faced crushing reparations debt. Alphonse de Rothschild personally organized the financial package that stabilized the French government. He later said, in effect, that his backing was the reason the government remained solvent at all. In London, the British government needed to secure ownership of the Suez Canal, a critical shipping route linking Europe to Asia and to British colonial interests. The Crown needed roughly £4 million immediately. Lionel de Rothschild reportedly provided the funds within hours. After Turkey's victory in the Greco-Turkish War, the peace settlement required Greece to pay Turkey roughly $30 million. Greece, lacking the funds, borrowed the amount from the Rothschilds. But Turkey already carried significant debt to the same family. Rather than the money physically transferring nations, it was simply moved from the Greek ledger to the Turkish ledger, settling Turkey's existing debt and returning in effect to where it started. By the turn of the century, the family's reputation for untouchable financial reach was, in the public imagination, essentially absolute. That level of visible influence came with a corrosive side effect. Across Western Europe, the family's prominence fed a wave of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The persistent false claim that a secretive network of Jewish bankers controlled entire governments. It is a grim irony that the most dangerous anti-Semitic political movement in modern history would rise in the very country the family had originally come from. Frankfurt was the birthplace of the Rothschild dynasty. But by 1901, the Frankfurt branch had no surviving male heir, and the family chose not to revive it. They liquidated the original bank in 1902 and converted the building into a museum documenting local Jewish history. The family had moved on from Frankfurt decades before the Nazis ever existed. Their historical shadow over the city, however, never left. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had devastated the global economy. Factories closed, banks failed. Millions lost their savings virtually overnight. People were frightened, angry, and searching for an explanation for a catastrophe that felt incomprehensible. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, built its political platform directly on that fear, advancing the conspiratorial lie that a coordinated Jewish financial elite was responsible for Germany's defeat in the First World War, its economic collapse, and its broader social grievances. To a desperate public, the legendary Rothschild name became a convenient, recognizable symbol onto which that propaganda could be projected. Despite the traction of that messaging, the Nazi Party itself was financially unstable through much of the early 1930s, by some accounts nearly insolvent by 1932. That changed after Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933. Hitler met privately with a number of Germany's leading industrialists and offered a direct exchange. He would dismantle trade unions and suppress the Communist Party, and in return, he asked for their financial backing. Several prominent industrialists agreed and funded the party going forward. There is a sharp historical irony here. A movement that built its propaganda around the myth of a secret financial elite controlling governments only achieved real political power because actual industrial elites chose to fund it directly. With that backing secured, Hitler moved quickly. Civil liberties were suspended, parliamentary checks were bypassed, political opponents were targeted. Within roughly 12 months, Hitler consolidated effectively unchecked authority over the German state. To consolidate ideological control, Hitler established the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. The ministry assumed direct control over art, music, theater, film, publishing, and education, meaning every newspaper, film, and broadcast in Germany operated under explicit party direction. Cinema became one of the most effective tools in that machine, and the regime's propaganda repeatedly singled out the Rothschild family as its central symbol. The reasoning was straightforward and disturbing in its simplicity. The Rothschilds were Jewish. They operated as an international rather than nationalist institution, directly opposed to Nazi ideology, and they were global financiers who practiced interest-based lending, which Nazi rhetoric specifically condemned as usury. In Nazi propaganda, the Rothschild name became shorthand for an entirely fabricated narrative of global Jewish financial control. That narrative reached its most direct form in 1940, with the release of the state-funded propaganda film Die Rothschilds, a fictionalized account that portrayed the family, alongside the British government, as a corrupt elite holding the world in financial servitude. To the regime, symbolically destroying the Rothschilds functioned as a justification for its broader campaign against Jewish people across Europe. The regime formalized its plunder of Jewish wealth through a policy known as Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned property and businesses to non-Jewish German ownership, executed by changes to German law. The primary beneficiaries of this policy were frequently the same industrialists who had financially backed Hitler's rise. Quandt was already an established industrialist with manufacturing interests in textiles, chemicals, and batteries. Under the new Aryanization framework, he aggressively acquired formerly Jewish-owned companies at a fraction of their value. In 1937, Hitler appointed him to a senior role overseeing Germany's wartime industrial economy, cementing his position at the center of the Nazi war machine. While individual industrialists expanded their private holdings, Hitler turned his attention to a more symbolic objective: Frankfurt, the historic birthplace of the Rothschild dynasty. Although the family's Frankfurt bank had closed decades earlier, the original headquarters still housed generations of family heirlooms, artwork, and historical documents. In 1938, the Gestapo seized and looted the building, dispersing the collection across Germany. By early 1938, Austria was politically isolated, with its principal ally, Italy, aligning increasingly with Nazi Germany. Public support for unification with Germany had grown substantially. On March 12, 1938, German military forces crossed into Austria and met no organized resistance. The annexation was formalized the following day. Within days, Baron Louis de Rothschild, until that point one of the most powerful bankers in the country, became a fugitive. Gestapo agents intercepted him at Aspern Airport in Vienna as he attempted to leave the country and took him into custody, holding him at the Hotel Metropole, which had been converted into Gestapo headquarters. His arrest drew international attention, including reported appeals from the British royal family for his safety. The regime, however, used him as leverage, demanding control of his business empire and personal fortune in exchange for his release. The myth of Rothschild invulnerability ended in that moment. A family whose financial reach had once shaped the fate of nations could not prevent a small group of Gestapo agents from detaining its own patriarch. Louis de Rothschild remained in custody for more than a year. His family ultimately negotiated his release for a reported $21 million, equivalent to roughly $400 million today, and likely among the largest individual ransom payments in modern history. Beyond the cash payment, the Austrian branch lost the bulk of its remaining assets: palaces, art collections, and land. One of the family's grandest Viennese residences was subsequently converted into a state prison. In 1938, the regime's priority in Austria remained financial extraction and forced expulsion rather than the more systematic destruction that would follow. That would not remain the case for long. On January 30th, 1939, Hitler addressed the Reichstag with a chilling warning, suggesting that if international financial interests provoked another world war, the consequence would be catastrophic for Jewish people across the continent. The statement foreshadowed the systematic genocide that would follow. War began on September 1st, 1939. As the conflict expanded, the seizure of Jewish-owned assets intensified dramatically. Historians estimate that nearly a third of the German war effort was financed through confiscated wealth, a pattern repeated across every territory the regime occupied. German forces entered Paris in the summer of 1940. Special task forces moved immediately against Jewish-owned property, including Rothschild assets, liquidating their banks, seizing private vaults, confiscating the Chateau Mouton Rothschild vineyard, and looting country estates and art collections. Critically, the family itself evaded capture. Baron Philippe de Rothschild and most of his immediate relatives had anticipated the threat and gone into hiding using forged identities, or fled the country entirely before German forces arrived. As in Austria, the seizure of Jewish wealth created an opening for opportunistic acquisition, and several of the same industrial families who had backed Hitler's rise expanded directly into occupied France. The Quandt family, who would later become the controlling shareholders of BMW, acquired multiple formerly Jewish-owned French businesses without payment. Friedrich Flick built a major steel empire by systematically seizing industrial plants across occupied Europe. Eugene Schuler, founder of L'Oréal, expanded his company's holdings, including a prime Parisian property confiscated from its Jewish owners shortly before their deportation, through close ties to the German occupation administration. Some of the greatest financial benefit during this period went to parties entirely outside occupied territory. The Wallenberg family, operating from officially neutral Sweden through the Stockholm and Skilda Bank, developed a technique known as cloaking, using Sweden's neutral status to disguise the true ownership of Nazi-controlled companies and assets, shielding looted wealth from Allied seizure. It is a financial technique still used today to obscure the assets of sanctioned individuals and regimes. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany controlled the majority of continental Europe. Britain stood as the last major obstacle, and the London Rothschild branch represented the family's final major stronghold. As the Luftwaffe began its sustained bombing campaign against London, the family, whose offices sat at the heart of the city, faced the real possibility that a single direct strike could collapse the institution entirely. In response, they established a secondary holding company, Rothschilds Continuation Limited, structured to function as a legal and operational backup. If the London headquarters were destroyed, this entity was designed to immediately assume control of the family's remaining global assets from an alternate location. The London branch's contribution to the war went beyond financial backing. Victor Rothschild, a trained scientist, served during the war as an MI5 officer, leading the agency's counter-sabotage unit. He was directly involved in disarming explosive devices and booby traps, and reportedly helped dismantle an active network of Nazi intelligence agents operating within London. The Royal Air Force's victory in the Battle of Britain ultimately halted German invasion plans, securing Britain's survival and preserving the time the Allies needed to eventually mount their counteroffensive. By 1945, despite being the singular focus of Nazi propaganda for over a decade and suffering severe financial losses, nearly every member of the Rothschild family survived the war. Their wealth, paradoxically, functioned as both the reason they were targeted and a layer of protection. Senior Nazi officials generally found more strategic value in holding family members as high-profile hostages for ransom than in eliminating them outright. Their resources and international connections also allowed many family members to flee Europe in time, rebuilding in London and New York. The family that Hitler's regime had vowed to symbolically erase ultimately outlasted the Third Reich. But survival did not mean a return to their previous position. Baron Louis de Rothschild returned to a post-war Austrian government largely uninterested in restitution. After a prolonged legal battle, he received what historians have described as a minimal settlement. He subsequently donated his family's grand Viennese palace to the Austrian state on the condition that proceeds support a pension for his former staff. In 1954, the government demolished the building instead. Many of the individuals who profited directly from Aryanization face limited post-war consequences. Friedrich Flick was convicted at Nuremberg for war crimes, including the use of forced labor, yet was released from prison in 1960 and went on to acquire a major stake in Daimler-Benz. His conglomerate was later sold to Deutsche Bank for billions of dollars. Günther Quant's son, Herbert, used the family's wartime expanded fortune to rescue BMW from near bankruptcy, becoming its controlling shareholder. His descendants remain among the wealthiest families in Germany today. The French and British branches of the family diverged sharply in the post-war decades. In France, the family rebuilt their Paris bank at its historic headquarters after 1945, only to lose it again in 1981, when President François Mitterrand's nationalization program brought the bank under direct state ownership, forcing the family from a building they had held since 1812. In Britain, the London branch took the opposite path, becoming closely aligned with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's privatization program in the 1980s, and serving as key financial advisors on the sale of state-owned industries. French political winds shifted again by 1986, restoring the family's legal right to use their own name commercially. They moved quickly, establishing Rothschild and Associés Bank. By 2003, the French and British operations formally merged into a single global entity, consolidating, after 2 centuries spread across the continent, into one unified institution. The story of the Rothschild family during this period illustrates a principle that recurs throughout modern history. Wealth alone does not guarantee protection. Without political alliances and influence over public narrative, financial power can become a liability rather than a shield. What ultimately preserved the Rothschild dynasty was not simply the size of their fortune, but a deliberate strategy, distributing the family across multiple countries so that no single attack could eliminate the institution entirely, maintaining political relationships that provided leverage even under extreme duress and, when the moment demanded it, recognizing early enough to act rather than relying on reputation alone. They suffered catastrophic losses. Branches were liquidated, patriarchs were imprisoned and ransomed. Centuries of accumulated property were seized outright. But the institution and the family persisted. In the end, A regime that built its entire ideology around the myth of an untouchable, all-powerful financial elite could not, in fact, eliminate the one family it most wanted to destroy. If this kind of historical and financial deep dive is what you come to this channel for, subscribe. There's more of this history still to uncover.